The Elves, by Ludwig Tieck. "Where is Marie, our child?" asked the father. "She is playing outside in the green square," answered the mother, "with our neighbour's son." "That they would not get lost," said the father anxiously. "They are rash." The mother looked after the little ones and brought them her snack. "It's hot," said the lad, and the little girl eagerly reached for the red cherries. "Be careful, children," said the mother. "Do not run too far from the house or into the forest, and I and my father will go out into the field." Young Andres answered, "Oh, do not be afraid, for we are afraid of the forest. We will sit here by the house, where people are near." The mother went and soon came out again with the father. They shut up their dwelling and turned to the field to look after the servants, and at the same time in the meadow for the hay harvest. Her house was situated on a small green hill, surrounded by a dainty stake, which also enclosed her orchard and flower garden. The village stretched down a little, and on the other side rose the Count's castle. Martin had leased the large estate from the lordship, and lived happily with his wife and only child, for he put aside annually, and had the prospect of becoming a wealthy man by work, as the soil was fertile, and the Count did not press him. As he went with his wife to his fields, he looked about him cheerfully, and said, "How different the region is here, Bridget, from the one in which we used to live. It is so green here. The whole village is resplendent with densely packed fruit trees. The ground is full of beautiful herbs and flowers. All the houses are cheerful and clean. The inhabitants are prosperous. Yes, it seems to me that the forests here are more beautiful and the sky bluer, and as far as the eye can see one's delight and joy in the generous nature. As soon as one is on the other side of the river," said Bridget, "one finds oneself as if one were on another earth. Everything so sad and dry, but every traveller also asserts that our village is the most beautiful far and wide in the round." "Except for that fir ground," replied the man. "Look back at how black and sad the remote spot lies in all the cheerful surroundings, behind the dark fir trees, the smoky hut, the dilapidated stables, the melancholy stream flowing by." "It is true," said the woman, as they both stand still. "As soon as one approaches that place, one becomes sad and frightened. One does not know why, who the people who live there actually are, and why they only keep so distant from everyone in the congregation, as if they did not have a good conscience." "Poor rabble," replied the young farmer. "Apparently gypsy people, who rob and cheat in the distance, and perhaps have their hiding place here. I am only surprised that the gracious lordship tolerates them." "They may well be," said the woman softly. "Poor people who are ashamed of their poverty, for one cannot say anything bad about them. Only it is alarming that they do not stick to the church, and one does not really know what they live on, for the little garden, which seems to be quite desolate, cannot possibly feed them, and they have no fields." "God knows," continued Martin. "As they went on what they might do, no one comes to them, for the place where they live is as if banished and bewitched, so that even the most insolent fellows do not dare to go there." They continued this conversation by turning into the field. That dark region of which they spoke lay apart from the village. In a hollow which was surrounded by fir trees, a hut and various almost shattered farm buildings appeared. Smoke was seldom seen rising there, and people were still more seldom seen. Sometimes curious people who had ventured a little closer had noticed on the bench in front of the hut some hideous women in ragged dresses, on whose laps equally ugly children were rolling. Black dogs ran in front of the hunting grounds. In the evening hours an enormous man, whom no one knew, walked over the footbridge of the stream and lost himself in the hut. Then in the darkness one saw various figures moving like shadows around a rural fire. This ground, the fir trees and the dilapidated hut, really made the strangest difference in the cheerful green landscape against the white houses of the village and against the magnificent new castle. The two children had now eaten the fruit. They fell into the habit of running into the race, and the nimble little Marie always won the lead from the slower Andres. "So it's not art," he exclaimed at last, "but let us try it into the distance, and then we will see who wins." "As you like," said the little girl, "only we must not run to the river." "No," replied Andres, "but there on that hill stands the big pear tree, a quarter of an hour from here. I will run past the Tannengrund on the left. You can run into the field on the right, so that we do not meet again until we reach the top, and then we will see who is the best." "Very well," said Marie, and she was already beginning to run. "We won't hinder each other on the same way, and Father says it's the same distance up the hill whether you go on this side or on the other side of the gypsy dwelling." Andres had already jumped ahead, and Marie, who turned to the right, no longer saw him. "He is really stupid," she said to herself, "for if I could only take the courage to run across the footbridge, past the hut, and over there again across the yard, I should certainly arrive much sooner." She was already standing in front of the brook and the fir hill. "Shall I?" "No, it's too terrible," she said. A little white dog stood on the other side and barked with all his might. In her fright, the animal seemed to her like a monster, and she jumped back. "Alas," she said, "now the rascal is far ahead, because I stand here and think." The little dog barked all the time, and as she looked at it more closely, it no longer seemed to her terrible, but on the contrary, quite lovely. He had a red collar on with a shining bell, and as soon as he raised his head and shook himself while barking, the bell sounded extremely sweet. "Egg! It just wants to be daring," cried little Marie. "I'll run as fast as I can, and I'm out quickly on the other side. They can't eat me up from the ground right away." So the lively, courageous child sprang onto the footbridge, quickly past the little dog, who became quiet and flattered her, and now she stood at the bottom, and all around the black firs hid the view of her parents' house and the rest of the country. But how surprised she was! The most colourful and cheerful flower garden surrounded them, in which tulips, roses, and lilies shone with the most beautiful colours. Blue and golden red butterflies swayed in the blossoms. In cages of shining wire, hung from the trellises, many-coloured birds that sang wonderful songs, and children in short white skirts, with curly yellow hair and bright eyes, jumped about. Some played with little lambs, others fed the birds, or gathered flowers, and gave them to each other. Others ate cherries, grapes, and reddish apricots. No hut was to be seen, but a large, beautiful house with a bronze door and sublime sculpture stood shining in the middle of the room. Marie was beside herself with astonishment and did not know how to find herself, but as she was not stupid, she went at once to the first child, held out her hand to him, and bade him good day. "Will you come to visit us?" said the shining child. "I have seen you running and jumping outside, but you have been afraid of our little dog." "Then you are not gypsies and rogues," said Marie, "as Andras always says." "Oh, of course, he is only stupid, and talks a lot into the day." "Just stay with us," said the wonderful little girl. "You shall like it. You will come back to him soon enough. Take it and eat." Marie ate it, and found the fruit as sweet as it had never tasted before, and Andres the race and her parents' prohibition were quite forgotten. A tall woman in a shining dress came up and asked for the strange child. "Most beautiful lady," said Marie, "I have run in without a moment, and they want to keep me here. You know, Zarina," said the beauty, "that she is only allowed to do so for a short time, and you ought to have asked me first." "I thought," said the shining child, "that since she had already been allowed to cross the bridge I could do it, and we have often seen her running in the field, and you yourself have rejoiced at her cheerful manner. She will have to leave us soon enough." "No, I will stay here," said the stranger, "for it is strange. and I can find the best toys here, and strawberries and cherries to go with it. But it is not so pleasant outside." The gold-clad woman went away smiling, and many of the children now jumped around the Merry Marie with laughter, teasing her and encouraging her to dance. Others brought her lambs or wonderful toys. Others made music on instruments and sang to it. But she preferred to stick to the playmate who had gone to meet her first, for she was the kindest and most gracious of all. Little Marie cried out one after the other, "I will always stay with you, and you shall be my sisters," at which all the children laughed and embraced her. "Now we want to play a nice game," said Zarina. She hurried into the palace and came back with a little golden box in which there was shining seed pollen. She grasped it with her little fingers and strewed a few grains on the green ground. Presently the grass was seen rustling as if in waves, and in a few moments shining rose bushes sprang out of the earth, grew up quickly, and suddenly unfolded, the sweetest fragrance filling the room. Mary, too, took hold of the dust, and when she had scattered it, white lilies and the brightest carnations appeared. At a sign from Zarina, the flowers disappeared again, and others appeared in their place. "Now," said Zarina, "get ready for something bigger." She laid 2 pine grains in the ground and stamped them violently with her foot. 2 green shrubs stood in front of them. "Hold on to me," she said, and Mary threw her arms around her delicate body. Then she felt herself lifted up, for the trees grew under them with the greatest rapidity. The tall pines moved, and the 2 children held each other, floating here and there, in the red evening clouds, and kissed each other. The other little ones climbed up and down the trunks of the trees with nimble dexterity, and pushed and teased each other with loud laughter when they met. If one of the children fell down in the crowd, it flew through the air and sank slowly and surely down to the ground. At last Marie was afraid. The other little ones sang a few loud notes, and the trees sank into the ground again just as slowly, and set her down when they had only risen into the clouds. They passed through the iron door of the palace. There were many beautiful women, older and young, sitting around in the round hall, enjoying the sweetest fruits, and a wonderful invisible music sounded. In the vault of the ceiling were painted palm trees, flowers, and foliage, between which figures of children climbed and rocked in the most graceful positions, according to the tones of the music. The portraits were transformed and glowed in the most burning colours. Now the green and blue were sparkling like bright light, then the colour sank back pale, the purple flared up, and the gold was ignited. Then the naked children seemed to live in the threads of flowers, and to draw in and breathe out with their ruby-red lips, so that one could hear the gleam of the white teeth alternately, as well as the flashing of the sky-blue eyes. Bronze steps led from the hall into a large subterranean chamber. There was a lot of gold and silver here, and precious stones of all colours sparkled between them. Wondrous vessels stood around the walls. All seemed to be filled with treasures. The gold was worked in various shapes and shimmered with the friendliest blush. Many little dwarfs were busy picking up the pieces and placing them in the vessels. Others, hunchbacked and crooked-legged, with long red noses, carried heavy sacks and stooped forward, just as the millers carry grain, and poured out the gold grains panting on the ground. Then they jumped clumsily to the right and left, and seized the rolling balls that wanted to get lost, and it was not uncommon for one to knock over the other in their eagerness, so that they fell heavy and clumsy to the ground. They made sullen faces, and looked scornful when Marie laughed at her gestures and ugliness. At the back sat an old, shrunken little man, whom Zarina greeted respectfully, and who thanked him only with a grave nod of the head. He held a sceptre in his hand and wore a crown on his head. All the other dwarfs seemed to recognize him as their master and obey his beckons. "What's back?" he asked sullenly as the children came a little closer to him. Marie was silent in fear, but her playmate answered that they had only come to look around the chambers. "Always the old childishness," said the old man. "Will idleness never cease?" Then he turned back to his business and had the gold pieces weighed and selected. Other dwarfs he sent away. Some he scolded angrily. "Who is the lord?" Marie asked. "Our prince of metals," said the little girl as they walked on. They seemed to be out in the open again, for they were standing by a large pond, but still no sun was shining, and they saw no sky above them. A small boat received them, and Zarina rowed very busily. The journey was fast. When they had come to the middle of the pond, Marie saw that 1,000 pipes, canals and streams spread out of the little lake in all directions. "These waters on the right," said the shining child, "flow down under your garden, and everything there blooms so freshly. From here you can get down into the great river." Suddenly, from all the canals and from the lake, an infinite number of children swam along, many carrying wreaths of reeds and water lilies, others holding red coral spikes, and still others blowing on crooked shells. A confused din echoed merrily from the dark shores. Among the little ones the most beautiful women swam, and often many children jumped to one or the other, and hung kisses around their necks and necks. All greeted the stranger. Between this tumult they led out of the lake into a small river, which became narrower and narrower. At last the boat was standing. They said goodbye, and Zarina knocked on the rock. Like a door, they parted from each other, and a very red female figure helped them to get out. "Is it quite funny?" Zarina asked. "They are in action," answered the latter, "and as joyful as one can see them, but the warmth is also extremely pleasant." They climbed a spiral staircase, and suddenly Marie found herself in the brightest hall, so that when she entered her eyes were dazzled by the bright light. Fiery red tapestries covered the walls with purple glow, and when the eye had become a little accustomed, she saw to her astonishment how figures were dancing up and down in the carpet with the greatest joy. So beautifully built, and of such beautiful proportions, that nothing more graceful could be seen. Their bodies were as if of reddish crystal, so that it seemed as if the moving blood was visibly flowing and playing in them. They laughed at the strange child, and greeted it with various inflections, but when Marie wanted to go nearer, she suddenly held Zarina back with force, and cried, "You burn yourself, Mauritian, for everything is fire." Marie felt the heat. "Why," she said, "don't the dearest creatures come out to us and play with us?" "As you live in the air," she said, "so they must always remain in the fire, and would languish out here. Just see how well they are, how they laugh and shriek. Those down there spread the rivers of fire from all sides under the earth, from which now grow the flowers, the fruit, and the wine. The red streams go beside the streams of water, and so the flaming beings are always active and joyful. But it is too hot for you here. We want to go out into the garden." Here the scene had changed. The moonlight lay on all the flowers, the birds were silent, and the children slept in various groups in the green arbours. Marie and her friend, however, did not feel tired, but strolled in the warm summer night with many conversations until morning. When the day dawned, they refreshed themselves with fruit and milk, and Marie said, "Let us go out to the fir trees for a change, what it may look like there." "You are welcome," said Zarina, "and at the same time you can visit our sentinels, who will certainly please you, for they are standing on top of the rampart among the trees." They passed through the flower gardens, through graceful groves full of nightingales, then climbed over vines, and at last, after long following the windings of a clear stream, came to the firs and the elevation which bounded the territory. "How is it," Marie asked, "that we have to go so far inside here, when the circumference outside is so small?" "I don't know," replied the friend, "how it is, but it is so." They climbed up to the dark firs, and a cold wind blew towards them from outside. A fog seemed to lie far around the landscape. Above stood strange figures, with flowery, dusty faces, not unlike the disgusting heads of the white owls, They were dressed in wrinkled cloaks of shaggy wool and held umbrellas of strange skins stretched out over them with bat wings, which stared adventurously out from next to the rockula. They waved and fanned incessantly. "I want to laugh and I dread," Marie said. "These are our good, industrious watchmen," said the little playmate. "They stand here and blow, so that everyone who wants to approach us may be seized with cold fear and wondrous fear. But they are so covered because it is now raining and freezing outside, which they cannot tolerate. Down here there is never snow or wind, nor cold air. Here is an eternal summer and spring. But if those up there were not often replaced, they would even pass away." "But who are you?" Marie asked, as they descended again into the scents of flowers. "Or have you no name by which you can be recognized?" "We are called Elves," said the friendly child, "and I have heard that we are spoken of in the world." They heard a great tumult in the meadow. "The beautiful bird has arrived," cried the children to them. Everyone hurried into the hall. They saw how young and old crowded over the threshold. All rejoiced, and from within a jubilant music rang out. When they had entered, they saw the great curve filled with the most varied figures, and they all looked up at a large bird, which in the dome with its shining plumage was slowly flying and describing multiple circles. The music sounded happier than usual. The colours and lights changed faster. At last the music ceased, and the bird soared rustling upon a shining crown that hovered under the high window which lighted up the vault from above. His plumage was purple and green, through which ran the most brilliant golden stripes, and on his head moved a diadem of little feathers so bright that they flashed like precious stones. The beak was red and the legs shiny blue. As he stirred, all the colours shone together, and the eye was delighted. Its size was that of an eagle. But now he opened his shining beak, and such sweet melody gushed from his agitated breast, in more beautiful tones than those of the love-loving nightingale. The singing drew more mightily and poured out like rays of light, so that everyone, except the smallest children themselves, had to weep for joy and delight. When he had finished, they all bowed down to him. He flew again in circles around the vault, then shot through the door and swung himself into the clear sky, where he soon shone at the top like a red dot, and then quickly lost his sight. "Why are you all so joyful?" Marie asked, and bent down to the beautiful child, who seemed to her smaller than yesterday. "The king is coming," said the little one. "Many of us have not yet seen him at all, and wherever he turns there is happiness and merriment. We have been hoping for him for a long time, more eagerly than you wait for spring after a long winter, and now he has had his arrival announced by this handsome ambassador. This beautiful and intelligent bird, sent in the service of the king, is called the phoenix, and it dwells far away in Arabia on a tree that is only once in the world, just as there is no second phoenix. When he feels old, he gathers a nest of balsam and incense, sets it on fire and burns himself, so he dies singing, and out of the fragrant ashes the rejuvenated phoenix rises again with new beauty. It seldom takes its flight in such a way that men see it, and if it happens once in centuries, they record it in their books of thought and expect wonderful events. But now, my friend, you will also have to part, for the sight of the king is not granted to you." Then the golden-clad beautiful woman walked through the throng, beckoned Mary to her, and walked with her under a lonely portico. "You must leave us, my beloved child," she said. "The king wants to keep his court camp here for 20 years. And perhaps longer, and now fertility and blessing will spread far and wide into the country, most of all in the vicinity. All fountains and streams become more productive, all fields and gardens richer, the wine nobler, the meadow fatter and the forest fresher and greener. Milder air blows, no hail harms, no flooding threatens. Take this ring and remember us, but beware of telling anyone about us, or we will have to flee from this region." And all around, like yourself, will then be deprived of the happiness and blessing of our presence. Kiss your playmate once more, and farewell." They came out. Serena wept. Marie bent down to embrace her. They parted. She was already standing on the narrow bridge. The cold air blew out of the fir trees behind her. The little dog barked heartily and rang his little bell. She looked back and hurried out into the open, because the darkness of the fir trees, the blackness of the ruined huts, the twilight shadows seized her with anxious fear. How frightened my parents must have been that night, she said to herself as she stood in the field. And I dare not tell them where I have been or what I have seen, nor would they believe me. 2 men passed by her and greeted her, and she heard behind her say, "This is a beautiful girl." Where could it have come from? With more hurried steps she approached her parents' house, but the trees that hung yesterday full of fruit stood dry, and without leaves today. The house was painted differently, and a new barn was built next to it. Marie was amazed and thought she was in a dream. In this confusion she opened the door of the house, and behind the table sat her father between an unknown woman and a strange youth. "My God, father," she exclaimed, "where is the mother?" "The mother?" said the woman reprimandingly, and rushed forward. "Oh, you are not. Yes, of course, you are the lost, the one believed dead, the dear only Marie." She had recognized her at once by a little brown mark under her chin, by her eyes and by her figure. Everyone hugged her. Everyone was joyfully moved, and the parents shed tears. Marie wounded herself so that she almost reached up to her father. She did not understand how her mother could have been so changed and aged. She asked the name of the young man. "It is our neighbour Andres," said Martin. "How do you come back so unexpectedly after 7 long years? Where have you been? Why didn't you let anyone hear from you at all?" 7 years? said Marie, and could not find her way through her ideas and memories. 7 whole years. Yes, yes, said Andres, laughing, and shook her hand sincerely. "I have won, Mauritian. I have been to the pear tree and back here again 7 years ago, and you slow one, you have only arrived today." They asked again. They pressed her. But she, remembering the prohibition, could give no answer. The story was almost put into her mouth that she had lost her way, had been taken on a passing carriage, and had been led to a strange place where she had not been able to tell the people where her parents lived. How she was afterwards taken to a far-off town where good people brought her up and loved her. How she had died, and how she had at last remembered her native region, seized an opportunity for a journey, and thus returned. "Let everything be well," cried the mother. "Enough that we only have you back. My little daughter, you my only one, my all." Andres stayed for supper, and Marie could not yet find herself in anything. The house seemed small and dark to her. She wondered at her costume, which seemed clean and simple, but quite strange. She looked at the ring on her finger, whose gold shone wondrously and artificially set a red burning stone. To her father's question, she replied that the ring was also a gift from her benefactors. She was looking forward to bedtime and hurried to rest. The next morning she felt more level-headed. She had put her ideas more in order and was better able to answer the people of the village, who all came to greet her. Andres was back at the earliest and was extremely busy, pleased and ready to serve. The 15-year-old blossoming girl had made a deep impression on him, and the night had passed without sleep. The lordship had Marian summoned to the castle, and here she had to tell her story again, which she had now become familiar with. The old gentleman and Madame had her good education, for she was modest without embarrassment. She answered politely, and in good words to all the questions put forward. The fear of the noble people and their surroundings had vanished in her, for when she measured these halls and figures with the wonders and the high beauty which she had seen in secret residence with the elves, this earthly splendour seemed to her only dim, the presence of men almost slight. The young gentlemen were exquisitely delighted with her beauty. It was February. The trees grew leafy earlier than ever. The nightingale had never before arrived so early. Spring came to the land more beautifully than the oldest old men could remember. Brooks sprang up everywhere and watered the meadows and meadows. The hills seemed to grow, the vine railings rose higher, the fruit trees bloomed as never before, and a swelling fragrant blessing hung heavy in clouds of blossom over the landscape. Everything progressed beyond expectation. No rough day, no storm damaged the fruit. The wine gushed blushing in enormous grapes, and the inhabitants of the village were amazed and were caught up as if in a sweet dream. The following year was the same, but people were already more accustomed to the miraculous. In the autumn, Marie yielded to the urgent entreaties of Andres and her parents. She became his bride, and in the winter she married him. She often thought back with deep longing to her stay behind the fir trees. She remained silent and serious. Beautiful as everything around her was, she knew something still more beautiful, whereby a slight sorrow turned her nature into a gentle melancholy. It painfully affected her when her father or her husband spoke of the gypsies and rogues who lived in the dark grounds. Often she wanted to defend her, whom she knew as a benefactor of the region, especially against Andres, who seemed to find a delight in zealous scolding, but she always forced the word back into her breast. Thus she passed the year, and afterwards she was delighted by a young daughter, whom she called Elfrida, thinking of the name of the elves. The young people lived with Martin and Brigitte in the same house, which was spacious enough, and helped their parents to run the extensive house. Little Elfrida soon showed special abilities and talents, for she ran very early, and could speak everything when she was not yet a Osmold. But after a few years she was so clever and sensible, and of such wonderful beauty, that all people looked at her with astonishment, and her mother could not help thinking that she looked like those shining children in the fir ground. Elfrida did not like to associate with other children, but avoided their noisy games to the point of anxiety, and preferred to be alone. Then she retired to a corner of the garden, and eagerly read or worked on the little sewing kit. Often she was also seen sitting deep in herself, or walking violently up and down in corridors and talking to herself. The two parents gladly let her have her way, because she was healthy and prosperous, but they were often worried about the strange, sensible answers and remarks. Such clever children, Grandmother Brigitte said many times, do not grow old. They are too good for this world, and the child is beautiful in nature, and will not be able to find his way on earth. The little girl had the peculiarity that she was extremely reluctant to be served. She wanted to do everything herself. She was almost the earliest in the house, and washed herself carefully and dressed herself. She was just as careful in the evening. She took great care to pack her clothes and linen herself, and to let no one, not even her mother, get over her things. The mother looked after her in this obstinacy, because she thought nothing more of it. But how astonished she was when, on a holiday, for a visit to the castle, she dressed her by force. However much the little girl resisted it with screams and tears, and found a gold piece of a strange shape hanging on her breast by a thread, which she at once recognized as one of those of whom she had seen so many in the subterranean vault. The little girl was very much frightened, and at last confessed that she had found it in the garden, and as she liked it very much, she had kept it so diligently in her life, she begged so earnestly and heartily to leave it to her, that Marie fastened it again in the same place, and went up to the castle with her in silence, full of thought. To the side of the house of the farmer's family were some farm buildings for the storage of the fruit and the implements, and behind these was a grassy place with an old arbour, which no one visited now, however, because it was too far away from the garden after the new furnishings of the buildings. Elfrida preferred to stay in this solitude, and it occurred to no one to disturb her here, so that her parents often did not see her for half a day. One afternoon the mother was in the buildings tidying up and recovering a lost thing when she perceived that a ray of light was falling through a crack in the wall into the room. It occurred to her to look through it to observe her child, and it was found that a stone that had become loose could be pushed from the side so that she could see straight into the arbour. Elfrida sat on a little bench inside, and beside her the well-known Zarina, and both children played and enjoyed themselves in gracious harmony. The elf embraced the beautiful child and said sadly, "Ah, you dear creature, I have already played with your mother, as with you when she was little, and came to visit us, but you people wake up too soon, and grow up so quickly and reasonably. That is very sad. If only you remained a child as long as I did. I would gladly do you the favour," said Elfrida, "but they all think that I will soon come to my senses, and not play at all, for I have the right disposition to become precocious. Oh, and then I won't see you again, dear Zarinchin. Yes, it is like the blossoms of the trees. How wonderful the blossoming apple tree with its reddish swollen buds. The tree is so big and wide, and everyone who goes under it also thinks that it must be something special. Then the sun comes, the blossom rises so affably, and there is already the evil core underneath, which afterwards displaces and throws down the colourful plaster. Now frightened and growing up, it can no longer help itself, it must become a fruit in the autumn. An apple is also dear and pleasing, but nothing compared to the spring blossom. So it is with us humans. I can't look forward to becoming a big girl. Oh, if only I could visit you once." "Since the king has been living with us," said Zarina, "it is quite impossible, but I come to you so often, my dear, and no one sees me, no one knows it, neither here nor there. I walk through the air unseen, or fly over as a bird. Oh, we will be together a great deal while you are little. What can I do to please you?" "You shall love me very much," said Elfrida, "as dear as I carry you in my heart, but let us make a rose again." Zarina took the familiar little box from her bosom, threw down 2 grains, and suddenly a green bush with 2 crimson roses stood before them, which bent towards each other and seemed to kiss each other. The children broke off the roses with a smile, and the bushes had disappeared again. "Oh, if only it didn't have to die so quickly again," said Elfrida, "the red child, the miracle of the earth." "Give," said the little elf, and breathed 3 times on the budding rose, and kissed it 3 times. "Now," said she, as she returned the flower, "it will remain fresh and blooming until winter. I will keep it like a picture of you," said Elfrida. "Keep it well in my little room, and kiss it morning and evening, as if it were you." "The sun is already setting," she said. "I must go home now." They hugged each other again. Then Zarina was gone. In the evening, Marie took her child in her arms with a feeling of anxiety and awe. She now gave the fair girl even more freedom than usual, and often reassured her husband when he came to see the child, which he had been doing for some time, because he did not like her seclusion, and he feared that she might become simple-minded, or even unwise, about it. The mother often crept to the crack in the wall, and she almost always found the shining little elf sitting beside her child, engaged in games or in earnest conversation. "Do you want to be able to fly?" Zarina once asked her friend. "How gladly!" exclaimed Elfrida. Immediately the fairy embraced the mortal and floated up with her from the ground so that they climbed to the height of the arbour. The anxious mother forgot her caution and leaned her head out in terror to look after them. Then Zarina raised her finger from the air and threatened with a smile, sat down again with the child, embraced her, and was gone. It happened more often afterwards that Marie was seen by the wonderful child, who always shook her head or threatened her, but with a friendly gesture. Often Marie, in her eagerness, had said to her husband in her eagerness, "You are doing the poor people in the hut an injustice." When Andres urged her to explain to him why she was opposed to the opinion of all the people in the village, and even to the lordship itself, and wanted to know better, she broke off and remained silent in embarrassment. One day, more vehemently than ever, Andres came to dinner and asserted that the rabble must be taken away as they were the ruins of the country. Then she cried out in indignation, "Be silent, for they are your benefactors and those of us all." "Benefactor?" Andres asked in amazement. "The vagrants." In her anger, she allowed herself to be led to tell him the story of her youth, with the promise of the deepest secrecy, and as he became more incredulous at each of her words, and shook his head in mockery, she took him by the hand, and led him into the room, whence he was, to his astonishment, the shining elf playing with his child in the arbour, and caressed it. He did not know how to say a word. An exclamation of astonishment escaped him, and Zarina raised her eyes. She suddenly turned pale and trembled violently, not in a friendly way, but with an angry air she made the threatening gesture, and then said to Elfrida, "You can't help it, dear heart, but they never become wise, no matter how sensible they think they are." She embraced the little girl with stormy haste, and then flew as a raven with a hoarse cry over the garden towards the fir trees. In the evening the little girl was very quiet, and kissed the rose weeping. Marian was anxious in her senses. Andres spoke little. Night fell. Suddenly the trees rustled, birds flew about with anxious cries, thunder was heard, the earth trembled, and lamentations whimpered in the air. Marie and Andres did not have the courage to get up. They wrapped themselves in the blankets and awaited the day with fear and trembling. Towards morning it became quieter, and all was quiet when the sun shone with its light over the forest. Andres dressed herself, and Marie noticed that the stone of the ring on her finger had faded. When they opened the door, the sun shone clearly towards them, but they hardly knew the landscape around them. The freshness of the forest had vanished, the hills had fallen, the streams flowed feebly with little water, the sky seemed grey, and when one turned one's gaze towards the firs, they stood no darker or sadder than the other trees. There was nothing deterrent about the huts behind them, and several of the inhabitants of the village came and told of the strange night, and that they had walked across the courtyard where the gypsies lived, who must have gone away, because the huts were empty and looked quite ordinary inside, like the dwellings of other poor people. Some of the household goods would have been left behind. Elfrida said secretly to her mother, "When I could not sleep during the night, and was praying from the bottom of my heart in the midst of the tumult, my door suddenly opened, and my playmate came in to take leave of me. She had a travelling bag on, a hat on her head, and a large walking stick in her hand. She was very angry with you, because she now had to endure the greatest and most painful punishments for your sake, since she had always loved you so much, for, as she said, all of them were very reluctant to leave this region." Marie forbade her to speak of it, and at the same time the ferryman came over from the river, who told wonderful things. At nightfall a tall stranger had come to him, who had hired the ferry from him until sunrise, but on condition that he should keep quiet at home and sleep, and at least not go out of the door. "I was afraid," continued the old man, "but the strange bargain did not let me sleep. Gently I crept to the window and looked at the stream. Great clouds drifted restlessly through the sky, and the distant forests rustled anxiously. It was as if my hut shook, and lamentations and whining crept around the house. Then suddenly I saw a white flowing light, which grew wider and wider, like many thousands of fallen stars sparkling and waving. It moved from the dark fir ground, moved across the field, and spread out towards the river. Then I heard a clattering, a clinking, a whispering and whispering nearer and nearer. They went to my ferry, and into it all climbed great and small shining figures, men and women, as it seemed, and children. and the tall stranger drove them all across. Many thousands of bright formations floated in the stream beside the vessel. Lights and white mists fluttered in the air, and everyone lamented and lamented that they had to travel so far, far away from their beloved accustomed region. The stroke of the oars and the water rushed in between, and then suddenly there was silence again. Often the ferry bumped up and came back and was loaded again, and they also took with them many heavy vessels, which horrible little fellows carried and rolled. Were they devils? Were they goblins? I don't know. Then came a stately procession in the undulating splendour. It seemed to be an old man, on a little white horse, around which everyone was crowded, but I saw only the horse's head, for it was covered all over with costly, shining blankets. On his head the old man wore a crown, so that when he drove over I thought that the sun would rise from there, and the dawn would sparkle towards me. So it lasted the whole night. I fell asleep at last in the confusion, partly in joy, partly in shudder. In the morning all was quiet, but the river has run away, so that I shall have trouble controlling my vessel. In the same year there was a deterioration. The forests died, the springs dried up, and the same region, which had formerly been the joy of every passer-by, stood desolate, naked and bare in the autumn, and scarcely showed here and there a little spot in the sea of sand where grass with pale green grew. The fruit trees all ran out, the vineyards were spoiled, and the sight of the landscape was so sad that the Count and his family left the castle the following year, which afterwards fell into disrepair and became a ruin. Elfrida looked at her rose day and night with the greatest longing, and thought of her playmate, and as the flower bowed and withered, so she bowed her little head, and was languishing before spring. Marie often stood in the square in front of the hut and wept over the vanished happiness. She consumed herself like her child, and followed him in a few years. Old Martin went with his son-in-law to the region where he had formerly lived. I hope you liked the story and are interested in more stories on this channel. If you liked it, subscribe to my channel and click on the bell so you don't miss any new stories in the future. Of course, I will be happy about a like.